You're standing in the middle of nowhere. The wind cuts through your skin like a blade. The temperature has dropped below zero in the last few hours. You have no refrigerator, no sealed packaging, no iodized salt from a grocery store, no preservative, no refrigeration, no protein that lasts more than 2 days, no way to save what you hunted yesterday to survive tomorrow. The meat rots, the wound festers, the body weakens before the storm even arrives. That would kill anyone unprepared, right? But the pioneers of the American frontier, the Arctic explorers, the nomads of the Asian steppes, and the Viking navigators did exactly that. For centuries, under conditions that would make most people give up by the 3rd day. It wasn't mysticism, it wasn't superhuman endurance, it wasn't luck, it was engineering. It was knowledge distilled through generations of error, death, and learning. It was a system passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, recorded not in books, but in the hands and habits of those who needed to survive in order to exist tomorrow. And at the center of that system was an object that seems too simple to matter. A horn, filled with salt. The salt horn, the frontier salt horn, was not a souvenir, not a decoration. It was survival technology disguised as a primitive utensil. But here is the question that will drive every second of this video. What really kept these people alive? The salt itself, the container that held it, or the protocol for how they used both together? What's your guess? Comment right now. We'll test each hypothesis throughout the video. Survival doesn't begin when the crisis arrives. It begins weeks before, sometimes months, before the first snowflake, before the first night without fire, before the game runs out and winter shuts down every route. The pioneers who crossed the Great Plains in the 18th and 19th centuries knew something most of us have forgotten. Disaster is predictable. What kills you isn't the unexpected. It's failing to prepare for the inevitable. And the choice of salt was life or death mathematics. First criterion, purity and grain size. Salt that was too fine absorbed moisture from the air and turned into a solid block within days. Salt that was too coarse was hard to work with in the field, difficult to measure, difficult to distribute evenly into fresh meat. The right granulation, medium, irregular, with a texture you could feel between your fingers, penetrated muscle fiber at the ideal rate. Not too fast, which would burn the surface and leave the interior raw. Not too slow, which gave mold time to set in before the cure was complete. Second criterion, calculated quantity. It wasn't about how much salt you could carry. It was how much salt you needed per pound of meat, per day of travel, per member of the group. The most experienced pioneers arrived at the frontier with that calculation already done. Too little meant lost meat. Too much meant extra weight that destroyed mobility. Third criterion, the container. And this is where the salt horn truly enters. Cattle or buffalo horn, hollowed out, cleaned, sealed with a wooden plug or beeswax. Not an aesthetic choice. Applied physics. Horn is naturally waterproof. It doesn't absorb moisture. It doesn't crack with temperature swings. It doesn't transfer metallic flavor like tin. It doesn't rot like exposed wood. Fourth criterion, positioning on the body. The salt horn was carried close to the body, not in an outer pack. Consistent body heat prevented internal condensation. A difference of just a few degrees between the frozen exterior and the warmed interior seems like a small thing. But on a journey lasting weeks, that difference determined whether the salt arrived dry or clumped solid. Fifth criterion, redundancy. No experienced pioneer carried a single salt horn. 2, sometimes 3. 1 for daily use, 1 sealed in reserve, 1 hidden deep in the gear for absolute emergency. If you lost everything, you still had the salt of last resort. Each of these decisions carried a direct consequence. Wet salt doesn't cure meat. Uncured meat doesn't make it to the next camp. Without protein, the body weakens at an accelerating rate. And when the cold truly sets in, a body without enough energy cannot generate heat. You don't die from cold. You die from hunger that became hypothermia. It looks simple, a horn filled with salt. But what the pioneers built around that object was thermodynamics and microbiology disguised as instinct. Let's open the system from the inside. First element, the curing process as a chemical barrier. When salt penetrates meat, It draws out water through osmosis. Without free water, bacteria cannot reproduce. This isn't magic. It's the same logic behind modern freeze-drying, behind the high-durability food that militaries and expeditions use today. The difference is that the pioneers had no laboratory. They had observation and error accumulated across generations. Second element, the horn's double function as a dosage regulator. The tapered shape of the horn was not an accident. The narrow tip controlled flow. You didn't pour salt, you tapped, tilted, rationed. In the field, without a scale, without a standard measure, the horn trained the hand to dose correctly. It was survival ergonomics. Third element, the role of fat as a second preserving agent. Salt alone was not enough for thicker cuts. The pioneers learned to combine salt with thin layers of animal fat applied over cured meat. The fat created a barrier against oxygen. Without oxygen, oxidation slows. Think of the principle behind modern vacuum packaging. Fat accomplished that before the technology existed. Fourth element, ambient temperature as a controlled ally. It was no coincidence that meat curing happened in winter. Low temperature slowed bacterial growth while the salt did its work. It was a window of time, like a dual protection mechanism. The cold held the process in check while the salt completed its job. Two independent systems performing the same function. Chemical redundancy. Fifth element, the container as a reading instrument. A well-maintained salt horn communicated the state of the salt without needing to open it constantly. Weight told you how much remained. Consistency when shaken told you whether moisture had gotten in. Resistance of the plug told you whether the seal was compromised. It was a passive diagnostic instrument. Sixth element, mobility as the central design variable. The salt horn existed because life on the frontier was not static. You moved. You changed altitude, temperature, and climate within hours. A ceramic container would break. A leather pouch would absorb moisture. The horn survived falls, river crossings, and freezing nights. It was field engineering, not kitchen engineering. Having the salt horn was half the system. Knowing how to use it was the other half. And this is where the inexperience died. Not from lack of equipment, from lack of routine. The most long-lived pioneers, those who crossed the frontiers year after year and returned, had protocols that seemed obsessive to outside observers. But every detail had a function. Every new camp began with an inspection of the salt before anything else. Before setting up shelter, before starting a fire. The salt was checked because everything depended on it. If there was moisture, the salt was spread near a heat source to dry before being used. Wet salt applied to fresh meat created a false surface crust. It sealed the outside while leaving the interior vulnerable. Meat curing had a schedule. It wasn't done carelessly. Freshly killed meat needed to cool before salt was applied. Residual heat accelerated spoilage during the window, before curing could begin. This detail almost no one notices. It seems counterintuitive. The urge to salt meat immediately after the kill was a beginner's mistake. Waiting for the body to cool, then applying the salt was the correct protocol. And here is the dilemma every survivor faced. Too much salt was a waste of an irreplaceable resource. Too little salt was wasting the meat. But the most common mistake was neither. It was applying salt unevenly. Thick cuts needed more time and deeper penetration. Thin cuts cured too fast and lost texture. The salt horn, with its controlled dosage, forced slowness, forced attention. It was design that prevented errors born from impulsiveness. Nightly watch shifts included checking meat in the curing process, not paranoia, prevention. A cut that was poorly positioned and pooling liquid underneath needed to be turned. Simple, but the difference between turning it and not could be the difference between functional protein and lost meat 3 days later. Ask yourself, can you imagine doing all of this from memory, without a thermometer, without a clock, without any external reference, in the middle of winter, with wind beating against the canvas of your shelter? That is what separates real survival from survival theory. But cold and scarcity were not the only enemies. On the frontier, danger came from multiple directions at the same time. Predators drawn by the smell of cured meat were a constant threat. Bears, wolves, and in some regions, mountain lions, all capable of detecting protein from miles away. The pioneers developed layers of defense that integrated the preservation process with their security strategy. Cured meat was stored elevated, hung from a structure above the reach of ground predators, but not only for security. The elevation also ensured airflow around the cut, accelerating surface drying. Two functions. One, positioning. The smoke from the campfire served a triple role. It provided warmth, repelled insects, and created an olfactory barrier that masked the smell of the meat. Experienced pioneers learned which woods produced the densest, longest-lasting smoke, not a comfort choice. Her security protocol integrated into the preservation system. There was also the human threat. In frontier territories, rival groups, outlaws, and hostile natives represented real danger. The salt horn, being small and easily concealable, could be hidden within seconds. The salt reserve, the group's most strategic resource, was never kept in a single location. It was distributed among group members. If one was captured or lost their gear, the system kept functioning. Layers of defense, no single point of failure, redundancy as philosophy. And when disease arrived, and it always did, salt had an additional function: wounds cleaned with saline solution, infections contained before spreading. The pioneers did not understand bacteria in any technical sense, but they understood results. Salt in an open wound prevented the festering that led to death. The empirical connection existed centuries before science formally confirmed the mechanism. Remember the question we planted at the beginning. What really kept these people alive? The salt itself, the container that held it, or the protocol for how they used both together? The answer is, none of the three worked alone. Salt without the horn clumped became unusable or was wasted through improper dosing. The horn without the salt was just an object. And both, without the protocol, without the inspection routine, without the correct application timing, without the redundancy of storage, without the integration with other survival layers, were poorly used resources. It was a system. Three interdependent elements that only made sense together. And that is the lesson that crosses centuries and lands here. It's not about mastering an isolated technique. It's about building a system where each part supports the others. The salt preserves the protein. The horn protects the salt. The protocol protects the horn. Training protects the protocol. And training begins before the crisis. Today you won't be crossing the Great Plains with a buffalo horn full of salt. But you will face crises. We all do. And the logic of the pioneers translates directly. Prepare the right resource in the right container with the right protocol before you need it. Don't accumulate equipment. Build systems. Don't learn techniques. Develop protocols. Don't rely on a single point. Build redundancy. There is a reason why the peoples who survived the most extreme conditions in human history left behind not just tools. They left systems. Patterns of behavior etched so deeply into their culture that they looked like instinct. They weren't. They were engineering. Tested under the worst possible conditions, refined at the highest possible cost, life itself, and transmitted to the next generation not as theory, but as daily practice. The salt horn is an object, but what it represents is a mindset. The mindset that survival is not reaction. It is layered preparation. Can you think of any system in your life today, in your home, in your routine, in your gear, that has this same logic of built-in redundancy? Think about it, comment below, because the answer you give will say a great deal about how deeply you've already internalized this principle. There are dozens of techniques like this one. Ancestral knowledge that seems primitive but conceals sophisticated engineering. Systems that peoples developed across generations to solve problems that modern technology has simply recreated with different materials. We're mapping that knowledge, translating it for those who want to understand the why behind things, not just the how. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.